So I first came across non-duality in Buddhism. I didn't know it was non-duality at the time. It wasn't till a few years later when I came across somebody called Eckhart Tolle that I began to hear the term non-duality. But the first time I came across it was with the Buddhists when they said, you've got to be in the moment, that freedom is being in the moment. And the first time I heard that spoken about, I was like 18, 19, I just started university, and I'd never thought about that before. It never dawned on me anything about the moment or being in the moment. But as soon as they said it, like my skin got like the chicken bumps. I think you call it chicken skin. In English we call it goosebumps, but I think Germans call it maybe chicken skin or something, or French. Goosebumps. And I just knew what was being talked about. There was something about that just being mentioned, that something came alive, that something resonated with that. And they had something called the Heart Sutra, which they always used to chant. It had a particular line in it. I had no idea what the Heart Sutra meant at the time. It's like hardcore non-duality, but they chanted it. And they had one sentence in it, something like, emptiness is form and form is emptiness. And it just used to like send shivers down me. There was something that knew that, even though Lisa had no clue. I thought it was something about me, like achieving something. And I used to like I'm into fantasy and sci-fi, and I used to read these Buddhist books about walking through walls and obtaining magical powers and going back in time and all types of crazy things. And I thought that sutra was something about magic, I don't know. But there was some other part of me that knew what was being talked about. And as I got into Buddhism, like I got pulled more and more towards the non-dual aspect of Buddhism. Even though the whole of Buddhism is about non-duality, I just got pulled more to those teachings. And there was something that deeply resonated and found so beautiful about this moment. Like I'd never had anyone at school or in the education system or my parents ever talk about that before. I knew it though from doing art or from playing, and I remembered it from childhood where you just completely lost in the moment, like what you were doing. It wasn't about future, it wasn't about achieving, it wasn't about getting somewhere. You were just playing for no reason, and you were lost in magic or wonder. And then I began to get into more what I would call hardcore non-duality, where people began to ask me who would be in the moment. And I'd be like, well, me. I'm in the moment. I thought in the beginning it was that I had to be in the moment, that I had to be here. But then the questions began to come, who would be in the moment? And how would that person be in the moment? And I was like, well, you just put your attention in the moment. You stop your mind thinking and you put your attention in the moment, and that's being in the moment. But they began to point out to me, and I began to realise that that still was thinking and an activity in time. That still wasn't being in the moment. That was still something that belonged to me and belonged in the thought realm. And it seemed so bizarre, these concepts, like who would be in the moment. I would be like, me! And like at first I really thought that was a like terrible idea, and I did exercises where they pointed the finger and was like, who's the finger pointing at? And I'd be like, me! Who else? And they kept asking that question, and I kept asking that question, who would be in the moment? And one teacher that I like called Tony Parsons, he used to say, like the time and the me are the same thing. Like me is in the word time. So if you're in the moment, you're already in time, so you're not here. It's already a thought, it's already something that's moved, it's already something that's passed. And that seems so abstract to you because the mind can't comprehend that there's something else. There's something there prior to the mind. So let me go back a bit then. So let me go back to talking about when you were born. So when you were born, in the beginning, and so if you were here yesterday, you'll have heard this before, but I'll start again as there's new people here. So when you were born, you didn't have a me. You didn't have somebody that could put their attention in the moment. You just were in the moment. There wasn't even a you there that was in the moment. Like, who would that you be that would be in the moment? There was just pure being. And your memory wasn't really functioning, so you can't remember that. But there was this pure being that was alive and present. And it couldn't imagine what wasn't here. It couldn't imagine yesterday or tomorrow. It just was here. It couldn't imagine what was coming, problems, difficulties. It experienced pain, the baby, but it couldn't think of anything. It just was. It didn't have a name, the baby. Even though the parents called the baby a name, the baby didn't identify with the name, or you didn't identify with the name. You just were there looking out, alive and present, like radically alive. And you didn't know that you were inside the body. You didn't have a thought that said, I'm limited and I'm inside skin. I am inside skin and I'm behind my eyes. That thinking hadn't developed yet. But there was this presence looking out, this consciousness that didn't know the difference between its hand and the ceiling, or the feeling of the crib and its back. It just was. It didn't know about two-ness. It didn't know about subject and object, about me and you, and happiness and sadness and pain and pleasure and light and dark and tall and short. It didn't know anything about thinking. It couldn't think. It just was alive, present, free, totally free. Even though you can't remember that, you most probably can remember childhood moments of being so unbelievably free and lost in wonder, like totally lost in what you were doing. You had no sense of who you were or who the other was or problems or what you were going to do tomorrow or what was on the calendar for next month. You were just playing and wondering and creating. But as a baby, you were totally free. And my friend told me this story, his two kids, and he told me this time that happened when both his kids were about 1.5 to 2 years old, that they began to do something where the baby would, if you've had kids, you might relate to this, the baby would throw the toy over the head. So at first the baby would just be like, meh, 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 and then would throw the toy over the head. No reaction. The toy was just gone. The baby couldn't think, there's a toy behind me and I just chucked it over my head. It was just gone. It just didn't exist anymore. It wasn't even the thought it doesn't exist. It just was not. It was and then it was not. And so it would keep doing this, like throwing the toy and then it was gone. And then finally, the child, the baby, turned round and looked at the toy. And then this went on for a while. And looking at the toy. And then this is the beginning of identification. So then, finally, it threw the toy over the head and then began to cry. And he theorized that the reason that happened was because suddenly the baby realized that the toy existed and he didn't have it, or she didn't have it. It existed without me. Whereas in the beginning of that exercise, when the toy wasn't there, it wasn't there. So when the toy was gone, there was nothing else that existed. There was only this present moment. There was only what was happening. And when the toy went, it was no different because this is all there was and it didn't exist anymore. But then the thinking mind began to process that there was a toy that disappeared and that the baby did not have it. So this is beginning of thinking and subject-object, and the beginning of the idea of me in relationship to things. And so, what in non-duality it says happens is that at 2 or 3 years old, something happens called identification with the body. And maybe some people remember this. I vaguely remember it. Before, you don't really know your name, and you don't really know who you are. you're interacting and you're functioning with the world, but you don't have a center. You're just like watching, there's just an experiencing happening, but there's nothing that's registering that or experiencing that. And then there comes a point where you begin to identify with the name and the body, and you begin to form an idea that you are that body and that name. And I was about 5, I was a late beginner. They nearly put me in special needs school. So I was about 5 when I identified, and I remember they kept writing down my name and telling me I was Lisa. And I remember having this feeling, if I didn't do that, if I didn't say my name is Lisa, that I couldn't be part of the human world. I know that sounds like I'm mentally deranged, but it was really a really strong feeling that I had to, in order to be part of my family and part of humans, I had to be a name called Lisa. And this, I suspect, happened to everybody, but you just can't remember it. I was a late developer, so I get the memory of it. So who was I before that? Like, who were you before you became your name? And I remember, like, looking in the mirror, and it was like, I am Lisa. But who was I before that? Who were you before that? We are so convinced and hypnotized in our society that we are name, and that we are body, that we're our gender, our age, our ethnicity, our financial background, our country, like our nationality. We're so hypnotized to believe that that's who we are, we forget our original essence. That cannot be who you are, because you weren't born into that world. And who you think yourself to be is always evolving and changing, so that's not something solid. But there is something in your experience that's always there, that's always been there, and that's been there before you were born and will be there after you die. And that's what non-duality points to. And non-duality is called non-duality because it means not two, something that isn't two in this reality. So it's really difficult to talk about because our language is dualistic, so our language is an opposite. So we know things by what they're not. We know somebody to be tall because they're not short, but it's all dependent. Like, so if I go to Holland, I'm short. I'm sure that I'm really not allowed to say this anymore. If I go to England, let's just say I'm tall. But in Holland, I'm definitely short. Or Australia, I'm short as well. Whereas in England, I'm tall. So it's not a fixed thing, it changes. Like if I was stood next to a giant, if giants exists, which maybe they do, or a gnome or something, then my size differs. It's a little like Alice in Wonderland, like the size differing. So we're not a fixed thing. Like our character, our name, who we identify with, isn't a fixed thing and is always changing. But yet we believe as a society that that is who is looking out of these eyes and that is who is experiencing. But is there something in your experience now that is prior to who you think you are, that's always been there? When my mum turned 70, she's now 76, she was like feeling a little bit depressed about being 70, and she's like, oh, I really don't feel like I'm 70. It's a shock when I look in the mirror and I see a 70-year-old woman looking back. She said, actually, most of the time I don't see a 70-year-old woman. It's when you catch yourself by surprise, you know, you're walking across, you're like, who's that old woman? Oh, that's me. And she said, I really don't feel 70. And my friend, like, I'd never really talked to my mum about non-duality. Like, she thinks that I teach positive thinking, and I'm like, yeah, we'll go with that. But my friend went for it. He was like, okay, yeah, you don't feel like you're 70. You feel like the same age as when you were 20, the same age as when you were 15, 30, 40, 50. You don't feel like you're a 70-year-old woman. And she was like, no, I don't. I do feel like the same age as when I was 21. And he was like, is it because your essence is ageless? There is an essence there that's looking out that does not have an age, that doesn't have a body, that isn't definable. My mum really got it. She was like, yeah, there is. And then I don't know what she made of it after that, but it was really sweet to see. And this is the same with all of us. All of us have an essence. And this essence we think of, maybe in the West, as individual. or we think it belongs to us. And sometimes we have an idea that it maybe is like it goes on from this life to another life, and it belongs to you in some way. But actually non-duality suggests, and from my experience, your essence isn't divided. And this is really quite magical. Now, even though I promised my boyfriend hardcore non-duality, I'm not going to use hardcore words. I'm going to use the word consciousness. So in non-duality, you can use different levels of words, and consciousness is like, it's an easier word to use because it has more meaning. We can relate to it a bit better. So I don't mean consciousness in the terms of something like Freud or Carl Jung, where it means conscious and unconscious. I don't mean that consciousness when I'm speaking. I'm talking about a bigger consciousness. What I talk about when I normally talk about your self-consciousness, I talk about it as personal awareness. When I say the word consciousness, I mean that consciousness that when you go to the doctors and you have a tooth out, oh no, well when I have my teeth out, they knocked me out. Like they give you an injection and the consciousness disappears, or seems to disappear. Like you go unconsciousness and then you wake up again and time has passed. I mean that consciousness. So that looking which is happening now out of your eyes. So in non-duality, they say there's only one consciousness. Isn't that cool? So everybody's got a consciousness. So it's not something to do with you as a person. That's not about your name or your personality or your unconsciousness or your personal awareness. It's that everybody's got that same consciousness, that same recognition of what's happening now. That instantaneous recognition of what's happening. And there's one consciousness. And to say in India or in Hinduism or in Advaita or Buddhism, they would call that, maybe, different teachers differ and different groups and organizations differ, God. So that's God looking out. So everybody is God looking out. And God is manifesting as multiple with unique personality structures that are being experienced. So let me talk a little bit more about this consciousness. So isn't that really amazing? So the first time I had that sense that it wasn't me looking out of my eyes as Lisa was, it was sort of gradual and I had many steps, but one time I had it really clearly. I was, actually I can't remember which was the first time, but one of the times, I don't like to lie, so I've got terrible memory. So one of the times I had this sense, I was listening to somebody speak and they said, right now God is looking out of your eyes, and I just had this profound sense of this still silence that was looking out and all things and touching everything and was everything, and it was totally still and totally silent, and it had always been there supporting everything. It was there holding the entire life of Lisa, the entire manifestation. And it was just really like shocking, like it's always been there. So let's talk a little bit more about this consciousness. So again, I'm not talking about Freud or Jung's description of consciousness and unconsciousness. I'm talking about that consciousness which seems to disappear when you go to sleep. It's not that it actually disappears when you go to sleep, it's just in sleep there's nothing to be conscious of, so there's just nothing. But it seems to disappear in sleep. I'm talking about that consciousness. And that consciousness is your birthright. You don't have to do anything to have that. It's free. Everything else in this life we normally have to pay for, but that consciousness is free. You don't have to be like, wake up in the morning and be like, excuse me, can I have some consciousness? It's just there. You wake up and you're instantly conscious, and it's there in every experience, and everything you do, there is consciousness. So right now, it's happening timelessly, that you are conscious of the sound of my voice. You're conscious of this seat, of this table, of the wall, and it happens instantaneously. There is no time in it. It's always there. It's always here. And what happens is that consciousness is conscious of somebody that thinks, and somebody that feels, and somebody that's telling a story of themselves. And that story of you and the consciousness intermingle, and then you think you as a person are conscious. But that consciousness is prior to the person and instantaneous, and it's your birthright. It's what's always been there. And it knows right now. It knows these sounds. It knows the feeling. And you don't have to, it's not like I have more consciousness than you, or your neighbour has more consciousness than you. It's there. It's the birthright. It belongs to everyone. You don't have to be a good person to be conscious. You don't have to do certain things to get more consciousness. It's always there. Always. And there's nothing that can take you away from you. You might think, oh, somebody could kill me and take it away from me, but you can't, because consciousness is prior to the body. So even if you die, it will be the form that's taken away, and then a new form will appear. Or there will be rest for a period, whatever. It will be, you can't have it taken. So this is really hard and really easy. It's incredibly easy because it's right here. It's incredibly hard because your mind is always fixating on things. The way we think is in opposites, in this and that. So your mind is focusing on something that you can intellectually think about and grasp. So when I begin to talk about something that isn't divided and isn't a thing, your mind is like zzz, zzz, zzz. It's like, it has a bit of a like short fuse, and it can't really get it. It can produce anger, it can just produce like confusion. Some people just don't hear this part of the talk, and then they come up and tell me about some therapy part they like of it, and I'm like, okay. But this it's like some people just have a blank out at this point, because you cannot grasp it in words, but yet it's here. Yet there is consciousness of this room. Like you think that, like I used to think that I knew this wall because I thought about it. Like, so I thought that I knew things because I thought about them. Like, I'd never considered that I could know things without thinking about them. But actually, your thinking can drop away and there is consciousness of the wall, but it's not got a name. It just is. It's the same with, like, you're focusing maybe on my face or my body, and then you know that in the background. You're not naming it, but it's still appearing. The same with the distance between us. So what does it mean if you're consciousness? It means that, this is the best part, for all the narcissists in the room, though it's never good to say this to a narcissist, hopefully there's none here, but it means that everything's appearing in you, not to you. Because what's outside of your consciousness now? Like, what is outside of it? Your mind could think of all these things. It's like, well, there is a festival out there, there's my mum, my dad, my kids, my wife, my husband, my money, my house. But that's sort of thoughts. There is nothing outside of your consciousness. Everything is in your consciousness. The whole world is in your consciousness. And this is where it becomes the teaching of not to-ness. I know your mind will have questions about this and be like, yeah, but there is a world out there, I know there is. But even science begins to question this. I can't tell, I'm not a scientist, I can't give you in-depth explanations about science, but even quantum physics, the experiment with the cat, which I'm not going to explain to you, begins to point to this, that actually things like matter doesn't appear until it's looked at. Like, so that's quite scary, maybe, if you've not thought about that before, because it actually means that right now we're suspended in the middle of nowhere. We're not in Sweden, in Europe, on a planet, in a solar system, circling an Earth, which I've just got to say is a really bizarre idea, but everyone's like quite happy with that. They're like, yeah. But when I begin to say, okay, but you're suspended in the middle of nowhere, everyone's like, I mean, it's quite bizarre that we're spinning a big ball of gas. But that's what it means, and that's scary, because it questions everything about the way that you see the world on the human level. Because normally the way we see the world is through you and your relationship with the world and your meaning with the world, and what your meaning is, what your purpose is in time. So normally Your day-to-day thinking is about where you are, where you're going to, where you've been, and what life is going to give you, and what you can get from life, or what life has done to you, dependent on your particular setup. So it means that that begins to be really questioned, because you're not anywhere. That's not who you are. There's a character, that's like a character that appears and functions, but that isn't who you are. So, so let's I'll just do a little bit more talking before I open up to questions. So, if everything is inside of you now, like if everything isn't happening to you now, and if everybody's is the same consciousness, like so if there's consciousness, so let me explain it in this way. So people get confused between how consciousness can simultaneously be looking out of all the bodies at one time, or how God, if you want to call it God, could be looking out of all the bodies at one time. And the reason humans get confused about that is because they project there is a brain onto consciousness. They project that consciousness should have a memory and remember all the different lives, so that you on the human level should see everybody else's life. But think of it like this. If we had a paper bag now, and I poked like 100 holes in that paper bag, and then I put a light inside that bag, there would be 100, like, and we turned all the lights out, there would be 100 streams of light coming out of that bag. And it's still one light, but it appears as many. And that's what's happening through everybody's eyes now and everybody's senses, is that consciousness is looking out, but it doesn't have a memory. It just is being conscious, and it can do it from multiple angles. Like time also is something that exists in the human world. It's not a fact. It's not like time comes before the creation of this world. Time is something that humans created and put onto the world, and time doesn't really quite work, because if you go in an aeroplane and circle the world really fast, I think, for a long time, then your time on your clock begins to go out of time on the ground. Like it's not a fixed thing. So, but this is something for you to contemplate for yourself, and not something for me to just keep preaching at you, and for something for you to see yourself. And this is the beautiful thing about non-duality, is it is something that you see yourself, not as you on the human level. It's a waking up and remembering there is something prior to the human. And that consciousness has no mission, it has no goal. It's not trying to make you a better person or free you or give you anything on the human level. It is simply experiencing this expression of life freely. And it supports everything. It's totally unconditioned love. It loves the sinner and the saint, the good and the bad. And that it has to. If it's going to be unconditioned love, it has to love it all. And that's hard for people that like are drawn to goodness, or on the human level, like have a sense of morality, because this isn't a God that discriminates, but that's absolute forgiveness. And if you look at Christianity, so I always think that non-duality is in the basis of all religions and all stories, and even in psychology I think non-duality is there. If you look at all religions, they do talk about this forgiveness. Like it is a huge thing. Like I love it. Like I think it's in Catholicism. I don't really know it very well, Catholicism, but that you do something wrong, and then you go and you admit it and you apologize for it, and then it's forgiven. That this is really beautiful. That it's very cathartic, and it's really beautiful for society to have that. But if you look at it in terms of non-duality, like our Creator, which is who you are, forgives every part of you, loves every part of you. So anything that you think is wrong about you, your essence is supporting and holding and loving, and has no judgment on at all. But I think what I'll do now is I'll just open it up to questions, because I can't gauge, if I'm going too much or if I'm not going enough. So if you have any questions, if there's anything you'd like to ask, no matter what it is, I'm so happy to speak about it. I'm also happy to talk about personal problems, but I do see it as two different things. Like I'm not opposed to working on the character on the personal level, and I do that if you follow me or if you listen to what I say, but at the moment I'm just speaking about the absolute. I'm not speaking about the person. Like, I've just been speaking about the absolute level. Yes, I think there's a microphone.